Lord Cassian Rothwell died 3 years ago. So who are you?
The man your precious Duke should never have forgotten.
Step away from her.
Still following orders, Subject 12?
Magnus, what did he call you?
Only one man ever called me that. And he taught you everything you know. He's dead. Look closer. That fire did exactly what I needed. You ask him.
What did he do to you?
Ask him why you're next.
The ballroom glittered with candlelight and secrets. A princess in ivory silk locked eyes with a stranger cloaked in shadow. A duke the court called cursed, untouchable, alone. She did not know his hands had ended lives in darkness. She only knew that when he looked at her, her heart forgot how to be careful. Welcome back to the Royal Duke Diaries. If forbidden love and dangerous secrets pull you in, stay close. This is her story. The kingdom of Elmsworth glowed under 1,000 chandeliers the night Princess Isadora Calloway turned 23. Music spilled through marble halls. Laughter rippled like silk. And yet, beneath every polished smile in that ballroom, something colder moved. Isadora stood near the tall arched windows, her curves wrapped in ivory silk, a diamond circlet resting against dark curls. She smiled for the crowd. She always smiled for the crowd. But her eyes searched the room for an exit that never came. Another toast to the princess, someone called, and glasses rose. She lifted hers too, though her fingers trembled faintly around the stem. She hated these nights, the suitors, the whispered evaluations of her waist, her bloodline, her worth. She was a princess, yes, but tonight she felt like a prize on display. Across the room, a man in a black coat stood apart from the crowd, untouched by its noise. He did not dance. He did not smile. He watched. Duke Magnus Draven had not attended a court function in 3 years. His presence sent a ripple through the hall. Hushed voices, curious glances, a few outright stares. Once, he had been the kingdom's most celebrated bachelor. Then his family died in a fire no one could explain, and he vanished from society, becoming a name whispered more than spoken. The lonely Duke, they called him. Cold, untouchable, haunted. What none of them knew, what only the king and a locked ledger in the palace vault confirmed, was that Magnus had not vanished at all. He had simply become something else. Something the crown used in the dark, when diplomacy failed and danger crept too close to the throne. A blade with a title. The palace's most trusted, most feared, most secret weapon. Tonight he was not here for wine or dancing. He was here because the king had received a threat against his daughter's life, and Magnus had been summoned, quietly, to find out who. His eyes swept the ballroom with practiced detachment until they landed on her, the princess. Something in his chest, something he'd buried long ago, stirred without permission. She was laughing at something a courtier said, but he could see it. The laugh didn't reach her eyes. She was performing. He recognized the mask because he wore one just like it, every single day. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. Isadora's breath caught. She didn't know him. Not truly. But something about his stillness, the darkness in his gaze, pulled at her like gravity. He looked at her the way no suitor ever had, not measuring her, not calculating her value. Just seeing her. She looked away first, heart hammering for reasons she couldn't name. Later that night, the celebration spilled onto the moonlit terrace, where the air was cooler and the noise softened to a distant hum. Isadora slipped outside alone, desperate for a breath that wasn't watched. She didn't notice him until she nearly collided with his shoulder. "Forgive me," she said quickly, stepping back. Then she recognized the black coat, the stillness. "You're the Duke of Draven." "I am," he said, voice low and even. "And you're supposed to be inside, charming your future husband candidates." A startled laugh escaped her, genuine this time. "Is that concern, your grace, or judgment?" "Observation," he said. "You look like you were drowning in there." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by something rawer. "Maybe I was." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt charged, dangerous, alive. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said finally, his gaze flicking briefly toward the shadows beyond the terrace railing. A habit, a soldier's instinct, though she couldn't have known that. Why not? Because the night isn't always as safe as it looks. She studied him, something curious sparking in her chest. "Neither are you, I think." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not." He left before she could ask what he meant. The next morning, the palace buzzed with quiet gossip about the Duke's sudden reappearance. Isadora barely listened, distracted by the memory of dark eyes that had looked at her like she was more than a crown. She didn't yet know that somewhere in the palace archives, Magnus was reading a report with her name at the top of it. A threat, an anonymous informant, a warning that someone close to the throne wanted her gone. He stared at her portrait pinned to the file and felt something twist inside him that had nothing to do with duty. A few days later, the king summoned Magnus to a private study lined with old maps and older secrets. "You saw the threat," the king said without preamble. "I did. Someone wants my daughter dead before her betrothal is finalized. I need you close to her, watching, protecting, without her knowing what you are." Magnus's expression didn't change, though something inside him resisted. "She'll ask questions, then give her answers that aren't true," the king said flatly. "You're good at that." The words landed harder than the king intended. Magnus inclined his head anyway. "As you command." He told himself it was only duty. He was already lying to himself. That evening, Isadora was informed that the Duke of Draven would be joining the palace council as an advisor on security, and, to her visible surprise, would be attending most royal functions at her side. "Why him?" she asked her father, frowning. "Because he's trustworthy," the king said, not quite meeting her eyes. "And because I need you protected." "Protected from what?" The king only smiled thinly and changed the subject. Isadora didn't believe the smile. She rarely did these days. By the end of the week, Magnus had become a fixture at her side, silent, watchful, infuriatingly composed. He walked 2 steps behind her at court events. He appeared, unannounced, whenever she stepped into a room full of strangers. He said little, but he noticed everything. It unsettled her. It also, inexplicably, made her feel safer than she had in years. "You don't have to hover," she told him one afternoon in the palace gardens, arms crossed as he trailed a respectful distance behind her. "I'm not hovering," he said. "I'm working. Watching me arrange flowers is work. You'd be surprised what people reveal when they think no one important is watching." She turned, studying him with new curiosity. "And what have you learned about me, Duke Draven?" He hesitated, a rare crack in his composure. "That you hate silence more than you hate crowds, that you smile widest when no one's asking anything of you, and that you're far more observant than anyone at court gives you credit for." Her breath caught at the accuracy of it. "That's oddly specific for a security assessment." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "I'm thorough." She laughed, and for a moment, the walls around both of them lowered, just slightly. Neither noticed the figure watching from the garden's edge, cloaked and silent, before disappearing into the hedges. That night, an intruder was found near the princess's private wing, subdued, bleeding, and gone before guards could question him. Only Magnus knew he'd been the one to stop him, and that the man had whispered something chilling before losing consciousness. "Tell the Duke," the intruder had rasped. "His old master sends his regards." Magnus's blood ran cold, because the man who trained him in the art of killing, the man he believed dead for 3 years, was apparently still very much alive. And now, it seemed, he had his sights set on the princess. The following morning, Isadora woke to whispers of an intruder in the palace and found her father unusually shaken. His guards doubled overnight. When she asked Magnus about it directly, he only said, "Handled," in a tone that closed the conversation entirely. "That's not an answer," she pressed. "It's the only one you're getting," he said, and something in his eyes, fear, guilt, restraint, she couldn't tell, made her stop pushing. She didn't know it yet, but he had stood over the intruder's unconscious body the night before with his blade drawn and his hands steady, the way they always were when violence was required of him. What wasn't steady was the thought that kept surfacing, unbidden, the entire time. If they'd gotten to her first. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't let himself. Later that night, unable to sleep, Isadora wandered the east corridor and found Magnus standing alone at a window overlooking the dark gardens, tension coiled tight in his shoulders. "You're not sleeping either," she said softly. He didn't turn immediately. "I don't sleep well in this palace." "Why not?" "Too many ghosts." She stepped closer, drawn by something she couldn't name, the ache in his voice, the loneliness he wore like armor. "Everyone at court thinks you're made of stone." "Good," he said. "It's safer that way." "Safer for who?" He finally turned to look at her, and the rawness in his gaze stole the breath from her lungs. "For everyone who gets close to me." The air between them thickened, charged and dangerous. Neither moved, Neither breathed. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. "You should be," he said, voice barely audible. "You have no idea what I am." "Then tell me." For one suspended heartbeat, it looked like he might. Then a guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor, and the moment shattered. Magnus stepped back, the mask sliding back into place. "Good night, Princess," he said, and walked away before she could stop him. She stood alone in the corridor long after he'd gone, her heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to longing. A few days later, the palace prepared for the Autumn Accord, an international gathering of nobility meant to secure alliances and, for Isadora, likely secure a husband. Lords from 3 kingdoms would attend, each hoping to win her hand and her father's favor. Among them was Lord Cassian Rothwell, a charming and ambitious noble from the Northern Territories, whose reputation for political maneuvering was matched only by his persistence in courtship. He wasted no time cornering her attention the moment he arrived. "Princess Isadora," he said, bowing with practiced grace, "the stories didn't do you justice." "Flattery this early, Lord Rothwell? You must want something." He grinned. "Only the honor of a dance." She agreed, more out of duty than desire. But as they moved across the ballroom floor, she felt eyes on her from across the room. Dark, unreadable eyes that hadn't left her since Cassian had approached. Magnus stood near the wall, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching Lord Rothwell's hand rest against the princess's waist with an intensity that had nothing to do with security detail. He told himself it was concerned for her safety. He was lying, and he knew it. That evening after the Accord's opening banquet, Isadora found herself on the same terrace where she and Magnus had first spoken. This time Cassian followed her out, his charm turned up like a performance. "You seem distracted, Princess," he said. "I'm tired," she said, though it wasn't entirely true. "Perhaps," Cassian said, stepping closer, "you need someone to remind you why these gatherings are worth attending." He reached for her hand. "That's quite enough." Magnus's voice cut through the night like a blade, low and controlled, but the fury simmering beneath it was unmistakable. He stepped onto the terrace, positioning himself, deliberately, between Cassie and the princess. Cassian's smile thinned. "Duke Draven, I wasn't aware that security extended to private conversations. It extends wherever the princess requires it," Magnus said evenly. "And right now, she looks like she'd rather be alone." Isadora glanced between the 2 men, startled by the tension crackling in the air. Startled, too, by the way her pulse quickened at Magnus's protectiveness. Cassian, sensing he'd lost this round, offered a tight bow. "Another time, then." He disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving the 2 of them alone beneath the stars. "You didn't have to do that," Isadora said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Yes," Magnus said quietly, "I did." She studied him, something warm blooming in her chest despite every warning bell in her mind. "Careful, Duke Draven. Someone might think you're jealous." His silence lasted just long enough to be an answer. "I don't get jealous," he finally said. "I get concerned." That sounded like a lie. It was, he admitted, surprising her, and himself. The confession hung between them, fragile and dangerous. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool night air. "Why does it feel like there's something you're not telling me?" she asked softly. His eyes darkened with something like pain. "Because there is." "Then tell me." "I can't." "Won't," she corrected. "Both," he said, voice rough. "For your own protection." Frustration and longing warred in her chest. "I'm so tired of everyone protecting me from the truth." "I know," he murmured. "I'm sorry." And before either of them fully understood what was happening, his hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb brushing gently along her jaw. She leaned into the touch instinctively, breath shallow, heart racing. "Isadora," he whispered, her name, not her title, for the first time. "Magnus," she breathed back. The space between them vanished to nearly nothing, lips a whisper apart, the entire world narrowing to the terrace, the moonlight, and the impossible pull neither of them could deny any longer. Then the palace bells rang, a sharp, urgent alarm slicing through the night. They broke apart instantly, instinct overriding desire. "Stay here," Magnus commanded, already moving toward the sound. "Magnus, stay here." He disappeared into the chaos before she could argue, leaving her alone on the terrace, breathless and shaken, staring after him with her heart still pounding from a kiss that never happened. Inside the palace, chaos had erupted. A fire had broken out in the west wing, deliberately set, judging by the scorch patterns Magnus found the moment he arrived. Guards shouted orders. Servants fled through smoke-filled corridors. And in the confusion, Magnus spotted a figure slipping away from the flames with unnatural calm. Someone who clearly knew the fire was coming. He gave chase through the smoke, catching only a glimpse of a hooded silhouette before the figure vanished into a servant's passage that shouldn't have existed on any palace blueprint he'd memorized. By the time the flames were extinguished, the West Wing library lay in ruins, and with it, decades of royal records, including, Magnus would later discover, every documented file on his own family's mysterious deaths 3 years prior. Someone hadn't just been sending threats. Someone had been erasing evidence. The following morning, the palace was thick with tension as investigators combed through the wreckage. Isadora found Magnus standing amid the ashes, his expression carved from stone, though his eyes betrayed something rawer beneath the surface. "You knew this would happen," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "Didn't you?" "I suspected," he admitted. "And you didn't tell me." "I couldn't. Because of the king's orders," she said, and when his silence confirmed it, something in her expression hardened. "What exactly are you protecting me from, Magnus?" He turned to face her fully, and for the first time, real fear flickered across his features. Not for himself, but for her. Something far more dangerous than fire. "Then let me help you fight it." "You don't understand," he said, voice tightening. "The people responsible for this, they don't hesitate. They don't show mercy. And if they think for 1 second that you matter to me..." He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd just revealed. Isadora's breath caught. "Do I?" The question hung between them, fragile and enormous. "Yes," he said finally, quietly, like a confession dragged from somewhere deep and guarded. "God help me, you do." Before she could respond, a royal guard interrupted, informing Magnus that the king required his presence immediately. He held her gaze one final second, apology and longing tangled together, before disappearing down the corridor, leaving her standing in the ashes of the West Wing with her heart in her throat. That evening, alone in her chambers, Isadora replayed every moment since the ball, his stillness, his protectiveness, the way he looked at her like she was something worth guarding with his life. It didn't feel like duty anymore. It felt like something far more consuming. She didn't yet know that in a locked chamber beneath the palace, Magnus stood before the king, receiving orders that would tear his loyalty in two. "The fire was a message," the king said grimly, pacing before a wall of old, damning documents. "Someone wants what's buried in those records exposed or destroyed before it surfaces. Either way, it means they're getting desperate." "Desperate people make mistakes," Magnus said. "Desperate people also make martyrs," the king countered. "I need this handled quietly, permanently." Magnus's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that meant. It was the language he'd been trained in. The language of silence, of blades in the dark, of problems that simply disappeared. "And if it leads back to someone inside the palace?" Magnus asked carefully. The king's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Then it leads back to someone inside the palace." The weight of the unspoken order settled heavily on Magnus's shoulders as he left the chamber, his mind spinning with implications he didn't yet want to name. Because the deeper he dug, the more the evidence pointed toward a truth he wasn't prepared to face. A truth that connected the fire, the intruder's chilling message about his old master, and a name buried in the destroyed records that made his blood run cold. A name he hadn't seen in 3 years, his own. Listed not as Duke Magnus Draven, heir to a noble house, but as Subject 12, a name from a program he thought he'd escaped forever, the very place where a lonely, grieving young man had been shaped into the palace's most lethal secret. And if that record had surfaced even briefly before the fire consumed it, someone else now knew exactly what he was. The next few days passed in tense quiet, the palace slowly rebuilding around the scarred West Wing while whispers of sabotage rippled through the court. Isadora noticed the shift in Magnus immediately. The added weight behind his eyes, the way his hand hovered near his hip, even in rooms full of trusted guards, the exhaustion he tried and failed to hide. "You're not sleeping," she said one evening, finding him again at the same window, staring into darkness that seemed to stare back. "Neither are you," he replied without turning. "Touché." She moved to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his arm. "Magnus, whatever this is, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." His throat worked as he swallowed something heavy. "You have no idea what you're offering. Then let me understand." He turned to her then, vulnerability breaking through the composed mask he wore like a second skin. If you knew the truth about me, Isadora, you'd run, and you'd be right to. Try me." For a long moment he simply looked at her, really looked, as if memorizing her face in case this was the last time he'd be allowed to. "There are things I've done," he said quietly, "in service of this crown, that would make you see me differently. Things I can't undo, things that make me dangerous. Not to you, never to you, but to everyone who threatens what matters to me." Her heart pounded, fear and fascination tangled together. "And what matters to you?" His eyes softened, darkened, burned. "You," he admitted. "Terrifyingly, you." The confession broke something open between them. Months of careful distance collapsing into inches, then nothing at all. His hand found her waist, tentative at first, then certain, pulling her gently closer. "Magnus," she breathed, his name a question and an invitation all at once. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, forehead resting against hers, "and I will." She didn't tell him to stop. Instead, her fingers curled into the front of his coat, drawing him the final inch closer, and when his lips finally met hers, it felt like every guarded wall between them shattered at once. Soft, slow, achingly tender, a kiss built from months of longing neither had dared name aloud. The world outside the window, the fire, the danger, the secrets waiting to surface, faded into nothing but the two of them, wrapped in candlelight, and finally unguarded. When they broke apart, breathless, foreheads still touching, Isadora whispered, "That felt like goodbye." Magnus's silence, heavy and pained, told her she wasn't wrong. "It's not," he said finally, though the words sounded like a promise he wasn't certain he could keep. "I won't let it be." But even as he said it, somewhere in the shadowed corridors beneath the palace, a figure studied the burned remains of the West Wing records with quiet satisfaction. Because though the file on Subject 12 had burned, a copy already existed elsewhere, and soon the entire court would know exactly what and who Duke Magnus Draven truly was. The following morning, Isadora woke wrapped in a warmth she hadn't felt in years, until a frantic knock at her door shattered the peace entirely. Her lady's maid burst in, pale and breathless. "Princess, you need to come see this, now." In the palace's grand entrance hall, a crowd had already gathered around a posted notice, an anonymous pamphlet, copies scattered across the marble floor, bearing a name and a title that sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the assembled nobility. Duke Magnus Draven, the palace's hired assassin. Isadora's blood turned to ice as she picked up a copy with trembling hands, scanning words that painted the man she'd just given her heart to as a monster, a killer, a weapon, a secret the crown had hidden in plain sight. Across the hall, she found him standing utterly still, surrounded by whispers and horrified stares, his expression carved from something between devastation and resignation. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for the first time since they'd met, Isadora didn't know what to feel. Silence swallowed the grand hall. Every noble, every servant, every guard stood frozen, staring at the man they'd feared without ever truly knowing why. Magnus didn't move. He didn't deny it. He simply held Isadora's gaze across the marble floor, watching the shock in her eyes slowly curdle into something far more painful, betrayal. "Isadora," he started, taking a step toward her. "Don't." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper, but it stopped him cold. "Don't come near me." She turned and fled up the grand staircase before anyone could stop her, ivory skirts disappearing around the corner as whispers erupted like wildfire through the hall behind her. Magnus remained rooted in place, the weight of every stare pressing down on him like stone. He'd known this moment might come. He'd simply never prepared for how much it would hurt. Guards moved to detain him on the king's order, but Magnus offered no resistance. As they led him away, his eyes lingered on the empty staircase, on the space where she'd vanished, and he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would make her understand. In the king's private study, the confrontation was immediate and unforgiving. "You knew this could happen," the king snapped, pacing before the fireplace. "I gave you a home, a title, a purpose after everything you lost, and now that secret threatens to unravel this entire crown. I never asked to be exposed," Magnus said evenly, though something raw simmered beneath his control. "Someone did this deliberately. The fire didn't destroy the records. It was a distraction, so a copy could be leaked without suspicion falling where it should." The king's eyes narrowed. "You think this goes deeper than a saboteur?" "I think," Magnus said slowly, "someone inside this palace wants me gone, wants Isadora isolated, and is willing to burn down everything, literally, to make it happen. The king fell silent, considering. Finally he exhaled. Find them. Prove it. Because right now, half the court is calling for your head, and the other half is calling for your dismissal from my daughter's protection. And Isadora? The king's expression softened, just slightly, with something like regret. That, he admitted, may no longer be my decision to make. Upstairs, Isadora sat curled in the window seat of her chambers, arms wrapped around her knees, staring blankly at the gardens below. Her lady's maid, Colette, hovered nearby, uncertain how to comfort a princess whose entire world had just cracked open. He lied to me, Isadora whispered, more to herself than to Colette. Every conversation, every moment on that terrace, was it even real? Perhaps, Colette said gently. Some truths are complicated, Your Highness. A man can hide a title and still mean every word he whispers. Isadora shook her head, though the ache in her chest suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. He held me like I was something precious, and this whole time he was, her voice broke, a killer, hired by my own father. She didn't yet know the deeper truth waiting beneath the surface, that Magnus's blade had been drawn more than once, specifically to protect her from threats she'd never known existed. That evening, unable to bear the confines of her chambers, Isadora slipped down to the palace chapel, seeking silence instead of answers. She didn't expect to find Lord Cassian Rothwell waiting near the candlelit altar, his expression carefully arranged into sympathy. I heard what happened, he said softly, approaching with measured caution. I'm so sorry, Isadora. Please, she said wearily, not tonight. I only want to help. He stepped closer, voice gentling further. You deserve someone honest, someone who doesn't hide daggers behind pretty words. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. How did you know about the daggers? Cassian's smile flickered. Just barely, just enough. The whole court knows, Princess. It's the only thing anyone's discussing. But Isadora's instincts, sharpened by weeks at Magnus's watchful side, caught the hesitation before his recovery. A small thing, easily dismissed. She chose that night to dismiss it anyway. Her heart had no room left for more suspicion. A few days later, the political fallout intensified. Foreign dignitaries who'd arrived for the autumn accord began quietly withdrawing their support, unsettled by whispers of assassins operating within the palace walls. The king, desperate to salvage the kingdom's reputation, faced mounting pressure to publicly distance himself from Magnus entirely. Strip him of his title, one advisor urged during a tense council meeting. Banish him. Let the court see the crown holds no tolerance for such deception. And if he's the only one capable of finding who's truly responsible for the fire, the king countered, though doubt had begun creeping into his own resolve. Meanwhile, confined to a modest chamber under quiet guard, Magnus spent his hours combing through fragments of memory and evidence, piecing together a pattern only he seemed to notice. The intruder's warning. The precisely timed fire. The leaked file, damning enough to destroy him yet strategically incomplete. Omitting, he realized with a chill, any mention of his years of loyal service protecting the very crown now condemning him. Someone wanted him discredited specifically, not exposed entirely. Discredited, which meant someone believed he was still dangerous enough to need silencing through disgrace rather than direct confrontation. And the only person with both the access and the motive to orchestrate something this precise was someone who moved freely through court, someone charming enough to never draw suspicion, someone who had suddenly become very interested in comforting a heartbroken princess. That night, working with the one guard still loyal enough to sneak him information, Magnus requested records on Lord Cassian Rothwell's arrival at court, and found something that stopped his breath entirely. Cassian's documented arrival date preceded the fire by mere hours. But according to border logs from the Northern Territories, Cassian Rothwell had already been dead for 3 years. The man currently courting Isadora, currently whispering comfort into her grieving heart, was not Lord Cassian Rothwell at all. By the following morning, Magnus had convinced his loyal guard to deliver an urgent message to the king. But before it could reach him, Isadora herself appeared at the door of his confined chamber, guards reluctantly stepping aside at her insistence. She looked exhausted, hollowed by sleepless nights, but her eyes burned with the same sharp intelligence that had first drawn him to her. I need the truth, she said without preamble. All of it. No more protecting me into ignorance. Magnus studied her for a long moment, weighing every consequence, before finally nodding. Sit. This will take a while. He told her everything, His childhood, the fire that killed his family under circumstances still unexplained. His recruitment into a covert program designed to create the Crown's most effective, most deniable weapon. The years of missions carried out in silence, in shadows, protecting a kingdom that would never know his name. And finally, the king's most recent order: protect the princess from a threat that had somehow known about her before the threat even fully existed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked when he finished, her voice thick with the effort of processing it all. "Because the moment you knew what I was," he said quietly, "I was terrified you'd never look at me the way you did on that terrace again." Her throat tightened. "And now?" "Now," he said, "I need you to trust me one final time, because I don't think Lord Cassian is who he claims to be, and if I'm right, you're in more danger than either of us realized." He explained the border logs, the timeline, the impossibility of a dead man courting her so persistently. Isadora's face drained of color as pieces clicked into place. Cassian's strange knowledge of Magnus's secret, his sudden appearances whenever she was most vulnerable, the unsettling familiarity beneath his practiced charm. "If he's not Cassian," she whispered, "then who is he?" Magnus's expression darkened with dread. "Someone who wants both of us destroyed, and I have a terrible feeling. I already know why." That evening, forced by circumstance and urgency into uneasy cooperation, Magnus and Isadora approached the king together, presenting the evidence of the impersonation. Skeptical but unwilling to dismiss the danger outright, the king agreed to a discreet investigation, quietly summoning the real Lord Rothwell's family for verification while keeping the impostor unaware of suspicion. The confirmation came within 2 days, delivered with grim urgency. The real Cassian Rothwell had indeed died 3 years prior. In a hunting accident his family had kept private to avoid political embarrassment. Whoever currently wore his name and face at court was an impostor of remarkable skill and patience. 3 years, Magnus murmured, the timeline settling over him like ice. "The same year my family died, the same year I was recruited into the program." Isadora's eyes widened with dawning horror. "You think it's connected?" "I think," he said slowly. "Someone has been orchestrating this for a very long time, and we're only now seeing the final pieces move into place." That night, unable to sleep, Isadora found herself once again on the terrace where everything had begun, the same moonlight illuminating the same stone railing. Magnus joined her without a word, standing close enough that his warmth chased away the evening chill. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly. "I know, not of you," she clarified, glancing up at him. "I was for a while, but not anymore." His hand found hers, tentative, questioning. When she didn't pull away, his fingers laced through hers, grounding them both. "I never wanted to lie to you," he said. "Every moment between us, the garden, this terrace, that kiss, none of it was a lie. That was the only part of me that's ever been completely honest." She turned to face him fully, searching his eyes in the moonlight. "Prove it." He didn't hesitate this time. His hand cupped her jaw, tilting her face up to his, and when their lips met again, it carried none of the tentative uncertainty of before, only certainty, only longing finally allowed to breathe freely. She melted into him, fingers curling into his coat, and for one suspended, perfect moment, the danger circling them both faded into nothing but warmth and closeness, and the quiet, breathless promise of two hearts finally choosing each other, despite everything working to tear them apart. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, Magnus whispered against her lips, "Whatever happens next, Isadora, I need you to know that loving you was never part of my orders. It was the one thing in my life that was entirely, completely mine." Her breath trembled. "Then don't let anyone take it from us." "I won't," he vowed. "Not while I'm still breathing." The following day, the impostor posing as Lord Cassian requested a private audience with Isadora, unaware his true identity had been uncovered. Under Magnus's careful direction, the king agreed to allow the meeting, heavily guarded, closely monitored, hoping to draw out the truth of his intentions. Isadora met him in the palace's private receiving room, every nerve steadied by the knowledge that Magnus watched from a concealed alcove nearby, close enough to intervene in a heartbeat. "You look troubled, princess," the impostor said, his charm as polished as ever. "I've had a difficult week," she said carefully. "Losing trust in someone changes how you see the world." "The Duke's deception, you mean?" He stepped closer, sympathy melting into something colder around the edges. "You're better off without him, you know. A man like that, capable of such violence, he'll only ever bring you danger." "Funny," Isadora said, holding his gaze steadily. I was under the impression danger followed men who lie about who they are. The imposter's expression flickered, a crack in the mask, brief but unmistakable. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Lord Rothwell, she said, deliberately emphasizing the name like an accusation. Or should I say, whoever you actually are. The reaction was immediate. His charming facade shattered entirely, replaced by something sharp and dangerous as he realized the trap closing around him. Clever girl, he said, voice dropping into something colder, unfamiliar. Though not clever enough to save yourself, he lunged. Magnus moved faster. He erupted from the alcove, blade already drawn, intercepting the imposter's attack before it could reach Isadora. Guards flooded the room seconds later, but the imposter fought with brutal, trained precision, clearly no stranger to violence himself. You should recognize this fighting style, the imposter snarled at Magnus as their blades clashed. After all, I trained you. The words hit Magnus like ice water. The mask, the disguise, the years of patient planning. It all clicked into horrifying focus as he finally recognized something familiar beneath the stranger's face. Not Lord Cassian Rothwell at all. His old master. The man who'd shaped him into a weapon, the very man he'd believed dead for 3 years. The same man responsible. Magnus now realized with sickening clarity, for the fire that killed his family in the first place, clearing the path to recruit a grieving, vulnerable young man into his program. You, Magnus breathed, fury and horror colliding. You killed my family. I made you, his old master corrected coldly. And when the crown decided you were more valuable to them than to me, I decided it was time to remind everyone exactly what I'm capable of creating and destroying. The fight that followed was brutal, desperate, every guard in the room struggling to contain a man trained specifically to evade capture. In the chaos, the imposter broke free, seizing Isadora as a shield, blade pressed dangerously close to her throat. Let her go, Magnus said, voice deadly calm despite the terror clawing through his chest. Drop your weapon, his old master countered, or I finish what I started 3 years ago. Isadora's eyes met Magnus's over the blade at her throat, and despite the fear evident in her frame, she gave the barest, steadying nod. Trust me. Magnus lowered his blade slowly, setting it on the floor, hands raised. You want me, not her. Let her go, and I'll give you whatever you want. His old master's laugh was cold, humorless. You always did care too much. It made you weak. It'll make you dead. But the momentary distraction, Magnus's surrender, his old master's contempt, gave Isadora the split-second opening she needed. Years of careful court etiquette had taught her poise weeks at Magnus's side, had taught her something far more useful. She drove her elbow back sharply into her captor's ribs, twisting free as guards surged forward to seize the opening. The fight ended moments later, the imposter subdued and restrained, though not before Magnus's fury nearly cost him his composure entirely, his hands trembling as he pulled Isadora into his arms, checking every inch of her for injury with frantic, desperate care. I'm all right, she whispered against his chest, though her own hands shook as she clutched his coat. Magnus, I'm all right. He held her like he might never let go. The weight of everything. The years of hidden violence. The fear of losing her. The impossible relief of her safety. Finally breaking through the composed mask he'd worn his entire adult life. I thought I'd lost you, he murmured into her hair. You didn't, she said fiercely. You won't. Not now. Not ever. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled fully before the court. Magnus's old master, a disgraced former royal operative who'd built and abandoned the very program that created Magnus, confessed under interrogation to years of manipulation, the murder of Magnus's family to sever his loyalties and force his recruitment, and finally, his most recent scheme. Infiltrating the court to destroy Magnus's reputation and eliminate the princess, ensuring the young man he'd once shaped into a weapon would have nothing left to protect, nothing left to live for. He wanted you broken, the king said grimly, once the interrogation concluded, addressing Magnus with something that looked almost like respect. Instead, you exposed him and protected my daughter regardless of every reason to abandon this palace and everyone in it. She's worth more than my reputation, Magnus said simply. She always will be. The king studied him for a long moment, before turning to his daughter, standing quietly beside the Duke with her hand laced through his. It seems, the king said slowly, I owe you both an apology, and perhaps a different kind of gratitude. By the end of the week, the court's opinion of Magnus had shifted dramatically. From feared secret to celebrated protector, the man who'd risked everything, weapon and title both, to keep the crown's most precious assets safe. Whispers still followed him through palace halls, but they carried admiration now instead of fear. Isadora, meanwhile, found herself facing a different kind of scrutiny. The political reality that a princess choosing a former assassin, however heroic his actions, would send shockwaves through allied kingdoms, already unsettled by the scandal. "They'll expect me to choose someone else," she confided to Magnus one evening in the garden where their earliest conversations had first bloomed. "Someone safer. Someone the court can easily accept. And what do you want?" he asked quietly, though the vulnerability in his voice betrayed how much the answer mattered to him. She turned to face him fully, moonlight catching the certainty in her eyes. "I want the man who stood between me and danger without hesitation. I want the man who told me the truth even when it cost him everything. I want you, Magnus, regardless of what the court expects." His hands framed her face gently, thumb brushing along her cheekbone with a tenderness that still surprised her, even now. "I love you," he said, the words raw and unguarded, stripped of every mask he'd ever worn. Not the princess, not the crown. You, Isadora, completely, terrifyingly, irrevocably you. "I love you too," she whispered back, tears of relief and joy blurring her vision. Even knowing everything, especially knowing everything, their kiss that night held none of the desperate uncertainty of before, only the quiet, unshakable certainty of two people who had fought through fire, deception, and danger to find each other, and had no intention of letting go again. A few weeks later, the king called a formal court gathering, the same grand hall where Magnus's secret had first been exposed, now transformed for a very different announcement. Nobility from across the kingdom watched as the king addressed the assembly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "3 months ago," he began, "this court learned a truth about Duke Magnus Draven that shook our foundations. What we failed to see, in our fear, was the depth of loyalty and love that truth concealed." He turned to where Magnus and Isadora stood together, hands clasped. "My daughter has chosen her heart over convention, and after everything this man has sacrificed to protect this crown, including his own reputation, I find I cannot fault her judgment." A murmur rippled through the hall, equal parts surprise and, gradually, approval. "Duke Magnus Draven," the king continued, "in recognition of your service and your sacrifice, I formally restore your family's full honor within this court, effective immediately. And," he paused, glancing at his daughter with something suspiciously like a smile, "I grant my blessing for your betrothal to Princess Isadora Calloway, should she still wish it." Isadora didn't wait for further ceremony. She turned to Magnus, tears bright in her eyes, and found him already looking at her with a warmth that had once seemed impossible for the lonely duke to hold. "Well?" the king prompted, amusement coloring his voice. "Do you still wish for it, Isadora?" "With everything I am," she said, never looking away from Magnus. The hall erupted in applause as Magnus drew her into his arms, sealing the promise with a kiss that no longer needed to hide in shadows or stolen moments. A kiss claimed openly, proudly, before the entire court that had once feared him. 6 months later, the palace transformed once again, not for scandal or fear this time, but for celebration. Isadora walked down the aisle of the grand cathedral in a gown of ivory and gold, every step steady and sure, toward a man who had once believed himself too dangerous, too broken, too haunted to ever deserve love. Magnus watched her approach with tears he didn't bother hiding, the weight of every shadow he'd carried finally lifting beneath the warmth of her gaze. "You look terrified," she whispered as she reached him, a teasing smile playing at her lips despite her own emotion. "Terrified of how much I love you," he murmured back. "It's the only fear I've ever welcomed." Their vows were quiet, sincere, stripped of grand political theater, two people who had survived fire and deception and danger, choosing each other completely, without hesitation, before a court that had learned, finally, to see past titles and secrets into the truth of who they both really were. A year later, the palace gardens bloomed brighter than they had in decades, and within its walls, a new chapter began, one marked not by fear or hidden blades, but by laughter, by warmth, by the quiet, unshakable devotion between a duke who had finally found peace and a princess who had never stopped believing in the man beneath the mask. When the healer confirmed, quietly, joyfully, that Isadora was expecting their first child, Magnus knelt before her in the same garden where they'd first truly spoken, pressing a reverent kiss to her hand. "A family," he whispered, wondering thick in his voice. I never thought I'd have one again." "You already do," Isadora said softly, pulling him up into her arms. "You have me. You'll always have me." And beneath the same stars that had witnessed their first stolen glance, their first confession, their first desperate kiss, Duke Magnus Draven, once the palace's most feared secret, finally let himself believe that love, real and unguarded, was a truth stronger than any weapon he'd ever carried. Thank you for staying until the very end, dear viewer. If Isadora and Magnus's love story stirred something in your heart, the danger, the longing, the courage it takes to choose love, even when the whole world watches, let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more forbidden royal romances every week. Until next time, this has been the Royal Duke Diaries, where even the darkest hearts can learn to love again.